Welcome to Dr. McNamara's talk today. It is on the objectivity of beauty, an introduction to the realist tradition. And my name's Alex Julian. I'm the headmaster of a Great Heart School in Chandler called Lincoln Prep, and I have the honor of introducing Dr. McNamara today. Dr. McNamara holds a BA in the history of art from Yale University and a PhD in architectural history from University of Virginia, where he concentrated his research on the study of ecclesiastical architecture with Richard Guy Wilson and Carol William Westphal. From 2000 to 2019, he was a faculty member at the Liturgical Institute of the University of St. Mary of the Lake, a graduate program in liturgical studies founded by Cardinal Francis George of Chicago. He served as associate professor of sacramental aesthetics, academic director, liturgy director, music director, and taught courses on the liturgical movement, liturgical art and architecture, liturgical enculturation, the liturgical year, liturgical music, and sacramental aesthetics. He makes a specialty of bridging the gap between the church's great artistic tradition and the documents of the Second Vatican Council. He has also done groundbreaking research on scriptural understandings of architecture and the sacramental meaning of classical architectural tradition. He's the author of numerous articles on art, architecture, theology, and culture, and his book, Heavenly City, The Architectural Tradition of Catholic Chicago, appeared on the Catholic bestseller list and won a Benjamin Franklin Award from the Independent Booksellers Association. So I encourage you after this talk to check out his many beautiful articles and books on architecture. Please welcome Dr. McNamara. Yes. There you go.
Sorry, I'll cheat. Okay, thanks very much, and thanks for coming today. Hopefully you haven't spent all of your intellectual energy listening to talks. I have no red paper to present today. I know you're disappointed. You'd like me to read a paper to you. We're going to look at pictures and talk like human beings, and part of what I have to say is I'm not a philosopher. If you're a Thomist philosophy professor, you're probably going to wonder why I don't make the distinctions that you like or use terminology that you prefer. I'm an architectural historian, wound up teaching theology for a long time, and had to settle the question in my own mind, how am I going to have a workable definition of beauty? And as you know, beauty is one of these things that people can't seem to agree upon. In my own graduate work, studying the great buildings of Western history mostly, we weren't allowed to use the word beauty, and we weren't allowed to use the word masterpiece because that was a subjective response and somebody else might disagree. And if you're classically minded, you probably have a sense of objective norms. This is good to know, this is good to learn. Nature gives you proportions in mathematics and geometry and harmony. History gives us something that's objectively good to know. And then you might know people who have a subjective response to that. They think you're crazy, you're narrow-minded, you're racist, whatever it is, right? So we have this life of objective and subjective back and forth. And we live in the time now of subjective primacy. My subject response to something is dominant. If I believe I'm a giraffe, you should call me a giraffe, that kind of stuff, right? And so the objective facts of things, they're hard to explain. So beauty comes into that same category because the modern world has decided that beauty belongs in the realm of the subject. I have an emotional response to something, I shed a tear, and therefore it's beautiful. I don't like it, and therefore it's not beautiful. What they call the realist tradition is the primacy of objective reality, or intellectual discussion. The beauty is known in the intellect and not in the emotions. So we'll talk about this today. So I had to do this terrible preparation for this talk called Most Beautiful Woman in the World. And you can imagine what came up. All these people in their makeup and their come-hither glances and all this kind of stuff. I actually had to put a box over this one down here. It wasn't quite NC-17, but probably a little racy for this event. Notice it's not this. And it's not the mom who's bringing new life into the world and trying to form children. It's this kind of surface notion. So the world doesn't know how to evaluate beauty. And so what's the process? How do you decide? And the natural questions come up. What is beauty? Is it a politically incorrect word, as people will say? Is it just in the realm of HGTV? If you don't have a barn door and an open floor plan and a leather sofa, you're not very tasteful. So therefore, is it just a luxury for rich people? And of course, I'm going to say no. And here's the fundamental question. Is it in the eye of the beholder? and therefore completely subjective. Your eye obviously takes in sense information, but it can't evaluate that sense information. So you can see already it's not in the eye in the beholder, it's in the mind of the beholder after viewing an object. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. Objective beauty doesn't mean a bunch of pointy-headed people get in a room and make decisions for the universal application of things. What it means is that an object, like this slide advancer in my hand, is revealing its own reality. And I could look at it and think it's a car or a kitten or a giraffe, but something's wrong with my subjective response if this object is not understood by me. And so that's why we talk about objectivity. And classically, in the realist tradition, it comes from Aristotle and through Aquinas, beauty is a participation in being. That's a participation in existence. And so rocks have a certain kind of existence, but plants have a higher participation in existence because they can move toward the sun and they can make seeds and make more of themselves. And then animals have a higher participation in existence because they have intellect and memory and things like that. And then humans, of course, being at the top, have the highest level of existence. So there's this concept of fullness of being on this side that the ancient Greeks maybe would have called the forms, the Platonic forms. Christians would call the mind of God or God himself. And then we tried to make things that have small b being. And so beauty in this realist tradition is the fullness of being, the fullness of existence. And then when you make something that approximates the fullness of existence, or at least climbs the ladder to it, you're talking about something more beautiful. And it's a very simple idea, even though it's very philosophically complicated. So in other words, there's an insensible reality, things that the senses don't know, justice, beauty, virtue, like what are those things? But then they become instantiated in matter. So a teacher has an idea of a perfect lesson, and you don't know if it's successful until you speak it, and then a student understands it and gives it back, and you start to say, okay, that's a beautiful paper. It's a beautiful exam. That was a beautiful thing you did by helping your classmate who fell on the playground or something. So the idea takes form in matter, and when the matter rises to the level of the fullness of idea, we call it beautiful. Now notice, the mind has to assess this, and so beauty is something that's more than emotions. In the Christian context, this would be God. God was invisible, unknowable, and then Christ in the incarnation makes God knowable and says, he who has seen me has seen the Father. But there's lots of ways to think about this. So I have a very brief working definition that I just give for regular people. We call a thing beautiful when it shows a clear revelation of its full ontological reality. And ontology, if it's a word you haven't heard before, these are fighting words in academia. Ontology, how dare you claim an ontological reality? Ontology is the study of being. Ontos in Greek means being. So when you say ontologically, are you male or female, you can see how that would become a very contested point these days. Ontologically, what is it to do this or be that? And so when you start talking about ontological things, you have to start saying, well, if they have being, where did they come from? How did it get here? What kind of reality does it have? What category is it in? We eat cows and we don't eat each other. There's some realization of our ontological dignity as human beings that really matters when it comes to the realm of acts, or what we call the moral life. And so I tell people, if you just add -ness to a word, you're talking about its ontological reality. What is dogness? What is schoolness? And I'm sure people who are here have lots of ideas about a good curriculum, a classical curriculum, and you know when one isn't good and which one could be better, and you need to find the right head of school and you need to find the right teachers. You're saying, I know what this is, and I want to see it instantiated in matter. This is the basic logic of the realist tradition. And so, I can ask you something simple like this, is this a Chiefs fan? No, right? Why? Because you know this guy, right? And you know that he's a Green Bay fan. It's because he's wearing ridiculous stuff on his head. And, if you're a Green Bay fan, this is a very serious spiritual reality for people up there in Wisconsin. I lived on the border of Wisconsin for a long time. We called it the Cheddar Curtain. Maybe you've heard that before. And there's this invisible reality. Guy standing there, and you may or may not know he's a Chiefs fan. Then a Green Bay fan. Then he puts this cheese on his head, which is not cheese. And even if it were cheese, the cheese is not a hat. The point is, these are all objects, right? There's a guy's an object. The stuff he's wearing is an object. And he is proclaiming, this is my otherwise unknowable, invisible reality, spiritual reality, intellectual reality. So it depends on us. You might look at that and never know, you don't follow the football, so you don't know what this is. So there's a subjective part to this. But if I don't know about Green Bay, it doesn't make him less a Green Bay fan. So the object, the guy, and his stuff has a reality that preexists and therefore is something other than what I decide it is. Now, I might be a Bears fan and hate Green Bay desperately. Fine, that's a real subjective response. Doesn't make him something other than what he is. So I'm going to give you a little quiz because this is what teachers do. What is the ness of this? Ontological reality of this thing here. Any votes for IKEA or Museum of Industrial History or Classical Academy? Or I have no idea. I don't know. There's one. Here's another one. IKEA, Museum of Industrial History. Or you might know what this is, actually. I just called it New Building in Plymouth, Minnesota. But you notice the objects you're looking at are conveying information to you, and the mind has to say, well, what is that? And then the mind has to assess if it's doing what it ought to be doing. So here you have the Providence Academy in Plymouth, Minnesota. It was named the most beautiful private high school in Minnesota by Architectural Digest. So here's a new building, newish building, that nonetheless is still thought beautiful. And the headmaster said, there's a commitment to beauty and symmetry, the thinking that every child can benefit from surroundings that confirm human dignity and raise our sights. This one on the right was a proposal for a school in Mexico in 2012. And the architect was talking about constructivism. And as teachers, you probably know that term. It's a term in architecture too. Whatever filters out of philosophy and winds up in education often winds up in architecture as well. Excuse me. And I just found a definition of constructivism, an approach to learning that holds that people actively construct or make their own knowledge, and that reality is determined by the experiences of the learner. So there's your subjective response. And so you don't want to present them with objective realities to which they conform, although that's an objective reality that you hope they don't conform to. So which is the more beautiful school? Is it purely subjective? How do we decide? This school on the bottom here is Art Deco school from the 30s. Pretty modern in its own day, but you might say it still has dignity. It still has the schoolness of a school. And when you want to assess if something is beautiful, the first thing is you say, what is the nature and dignity of learning and therefore a school building? So architecture takes its place in the hierarchy of things from the purpose to which it's put. So you go to a Roman, Italian city, you're going to see the churches, the cathedral probably, consider the highest status activity, so it's the highest status building, it'll be the biggest, it'll have the dome. And then you say, does this building express well and fully this invisible idea? Right? This is the simple beauty test in the realist tradition. You have to know what a thing is, and then assess whether the thing reveals that knowledge. Now the question is, if it does, we call it beautiful, what does the building on the top look like to you? If I had to say, what is that? Well, there it is. I have a rule in my own life, which is if your building doesn't look like a building, it will look like something, whether it's a church or a house or whatever. And usually it's not flattering if it doesn't look like something. So I had an idea for this, and this is what I thought it looked like. I put in robot centipede, and this is the picture that came up. So, is that really what you want? Your kids to be walking into the mouth of a robot centipede every morning? Now, you might say, that's cool, I've never seen that before, it's going to mark us as cutting edge, we're a STEM school, and it looks technological, so the school should look technological. Okay, maybe, but that's pretty shallow thinking. You know, higher and better is something, in a classical academy in particular. You know, good, interesting thought experiment, if I said, please draw a beautiful Procyon lotor, how do you start? I have a feeling about Procyon lotors. I hate Procyon lotors. What's the first question? What is a... so the intellect is engaged. This is a Procyon lotor, by the way. Cute little raccoon. And notice, you can assess if this is a beautiful raccoon because you know what a raccoon is. And this is something we do quickly and subconsciously. But if you want to be conscious of this, you could say, well, this has some Procyon lotorness, right? It has legs and ears and a mouth. It just doesn't do it very well. It's not a good revelation of the ontological reality of a raccoon, although it's a pretty darn nice elephant. And so you have to know what ontological category you're in. So notice, assessing beauty presumes knowledge of what a thing is, and therefore what should be done. And this is where beauty and truth come together, because a beautiful thing reveals the truth at a high level of existence and also in a delightful way. So, you have your questions about what curriculum better corresponds to a purpose of education. You have to then say, well, what's a student? What's a child? What is knowledge? What's a citizen? What's virtue? And then how do we make that best express that reality? The world wants this side, right? Self-expression 101, and there's some virtue to that. But if your self-expression isn't formed, it's just going to become divisive and maybe even dangerous. So, reasons to care about any of this thinking about beauty is the classic thinking in the realist tradition is beauty is that about the truth which we find attractive and delightful, which makes us delight in knowing it. So you can ask for funding for the poor and walk around angry all the time, or you can do this beautiful thing of actually taking care of the poor. They both do something that's real and good to a certain point, but one's kind of delightful and one is angry and maybe off-putting. So, I was told about the Veritas Academy in Richmond, just bought this old school down there. And so you can say, well, which one of these things is actually in the object itself revealing the intellectual understanding that we have of what a thing is at the level of what's true about it. Now, this is the kind of thing you can disagree about. You can go out of this room and have lots of discussions, and you can ask me questions, and I can ask you questions, because if it's in the realm of intellect, you can actually talk about it. If it's in the realm of emotion, well, your feeling's as valid as mine. What's your favorite color? Blue. Oh, no, you're an idiot. It should be red. You can't have that kind of discussion. And so if it's a fact-based or an idea-based thing, then you can say, well, you know what? In our system, that doesn't really reveal schoolness as well because 1, 2, 3, and then you can have a good argument. I've learned often that stock images like these things are often good at capturing the essence of something that people understand. So I just found this one. I was doing all kinds of searches for classical academies, and this one came up. It doesn't say school on it anywhere, right? And if you have to put a sign on something, it usually is an admission of failure. This is a school already, even though it doesn't say school on it. And there are many various versions of this. So this requires intellectual inquiry. And maybe you've learned the difference between intellectus and ratio, that there are two ways of knowing. Intellectus, coming out of the Thomistic tradition and others, it's a kind of intuitive knowing that sees the whole picture. So you see a building, you say, wow, now that's a fill in the blank. That's a McDonald's. That's a skyscraper. That's a classical academy. And you get the gist of it. And then you might say, well, what makes this school, and this is a school in Sugar Land, Texas, what makes this school have schoolness? And then you start reading architectural theory. So intellectus and ratio are both important ways of knowing, but you wouldn't want someone to say, well, I saw your building and the sign said school, but it doesn't look like a school. Is this really a school? Am I at the right place? This is a great arts academy, or what is this? Oh, well, okay, yeah, I guess I found out your history and so on. You want to have them have the deep intuitive knowledge first, and then come to know it at a deeper level. So here are some of these things. If you read the philosophical articles by Umberto Eco and G.B. Phelan and Jacques Maritain and others, they'll say beauty is the power of reality to please in being contemplated. So when you contemplate something and you come to know what it is, your soul or your mind that desires to understand suddenly understands. You have a student who doesn't get it, and then they get it. And the light bulb, like the cartoons over their head, there's a pleasure in knowing, and it's not just the pleasure in figuring out the homework, it's the pleasure in knowing what the homework wants you to know. And so this is something beautiful. It gives a joy in knowing. If you've ever had a lesson plan, you're just like, man, I was really good at this. The students loved it. They got the point. They went home happy. They told their mom and dad. You gave a beautiful lesson, and they learned the thing, right? If it's mere cotton candy, they didn't learn anything. That's not beauty. And it's this superabounding joy. And they would say it exalts and delights the soul. And what you call this is an inmost understanding of the ontological reality of a thing. In the Christian tradition, they'd call this a flash of the divine mind, because God's mind understands perfectly. And we don't understand perfectly, but when we do, we start to experience existence at a higher level. And eventually that level would be the divine mind. And the ancients would call it something different, but it's basically the same idea. So here's a really important thing. In what human capacity is beauty perceived? It's not the emotions. No matter what the art museum people tell you, it's in the mind. Now the emotions are part of it. You look at something and you have an emotional response. I don't want to be anti-emotion. But principally the mind assesses beauty. And the beauty is located not in the mind primarily, but in the object. That's why it's called the objective approach to beauty. And people look at things that remind them of their childhood, or they have an experience of the divine and they cry. That's totally legit. but it's the object that gives the encounter, and then the mind has to assess what those emotions mean, and emotions point to reality. A student who's having trouble and is frustrated is crying because they're not learning well. That's the objective reality of that problem, and the emotions are these arrows that point problem, or exaltation, delight, happiness, goodness, truth. And so they're very important, but they're not primary in this system of understanding. You know, Kant and others would say beauty resides in the mind. You look at a thing and you construct in your mind what that thing is, and beauty resides there. This Thomistic approach, what they call the realist approach, means the beauty resides in the object, and then secondarily in the mind once the person perceives it. And this is where objectivity comes from. I had a teacher in graduate school, Bill Westphal, who used to say to us as grad students, if a beautiful building is beautiful and you don't know it, then you and not it are deficient. And this was very mean sounding to me at the time. But, you know, anybody who's dragged a kid through the Louvre, you know, and it's like, Mom, can we go to McDonald's? This is so boring. Right? It doesn't change the Mona Lisa into something else, right? It just means that the kid isn't ready for it. So the objective primacy is this classical tradition. And we have, you know, these gender questions and all. We would say objectively, what chromosome do you have, right? But this is not politically correct these days. How do you bring all those things into relationship is a tough question these days, but beauty is a quality of being. It's in the existence of the thing itself. And if it is, it participates in beauty at some level because it reveals its own reality. Things that have more being and reveal it at that high level would be more beautiful, and things that have less are less. And so there are kinds of beauty. There's beauty proper to a raccoon, there's beauty proper to an elephant, there's beauty proper to a chair, and it requires a perceiver. So again, I don't want to undersell the importance of a perceiver, but in this system, objective primacy is first because it's an object of intelligence. The mind encounters sense information, the senses encounter sense information, and the mind decides what to do with that. Notice this is not the same as I like it, because a lot of people like things that are not good for them. Any addict likes a lot of things that are not helpful, and the mind has to assess the desires. And you just ask a simple question. Is a poorly designed building made of shoddy materials and has no classrooms suitable for a new school? The intuitive answer is immediate, but then the brain kicks in and says, well, no, we're building something to last. It can't fall apart in a year. Of course we need classrooms. This is an intellectual question, and it can't be beautiful if it doesn't fulfill these basic requirements. So maybe you've heard the famous triad of beauty from Thomas Aquinas. If anybody knows anything about Aquinas and beauty, it's this, that beauty appears at the intersection of perfection or wholeness. You can see if your school has no classrooms, something's wrong with it. It's called integritas in Latin or integrity in English. Consonantia is proportionality, due proportion among parts of a thing or proportion in relation to an end. So you might say, well, you know, the teacher's lounge is the size of a telephone booth, not proportional to its use. The doors are 1 inch high, not proportional to people. But then you can also say, what's the purpose of education? When a student walks through the front door, is it a portal that speaks of the dignity of entering rather than a hole in the wall that speaks of the process or the function of entering? And so this relation to an end or a telos is important. And then claritas is the revelation, the power to reveal what a thing is. So if you ever make a recipe for cookies or something and the proportions are wrong, it's not going to reveal cookiness as well as it should. Chocolate chip cookies without chocolate chips are not chocolate chip cookies, and they lose their power to reveal chocolate chip cookiness, for instance. And so it's not that complicated, really, at the end of the day. You have to have everything you need to have to reveal what you are. It has to be in proportion to reveal what you are, and then it has the power to reveal it when all these things are in the right place. And so how do you analyze a school? I just did it, right? No classrooms is a problem. Doors that are too small is a problem. But then you get to this philosophical realm. I want a student to get off the bus or out of the car and see the front door of a school and say, I'm coming to an important place. The dignity of learning is represented by this portal, which speaks of the importance of entering, rather than the door of a Walmart or a Burger King, which just keeps the weather out of the inside. Now, one of the things that I'm going to give you the answer to win all your Thanksgiving argument with your family about whether beauty is in the eye of the beholder comes from this one phrase from Thomas in Latin, pulchra decuntur que visa placent, which literally transliterated means beautiful are called things which when seen please. It's been translated as beauty is in the eye of the beholder. And if you're Latinist, you may know visa can be more than one infinitive. It can be videre and it can be visere, and they both can be conjugated this way. So when something is seen, what does that mean? Does it just mean the eyeballs have perceived it? This is how the modern world tends to translate it. Videre is to perceive with the eye without necessarily paying attention. So sense stimulation of the eyeball. Viscere means to contemplate the depths of something. The student says, oh, now I see, now I get it. This is what they're talking about. So the question is, Thomas didn't give us a footnote to tell us which infinitive it was, but if you understand this system, which one is it? Videre or viscere? Viscere, right? To see the depths of something. That means to perceive the ontological reality of something. And when a thing reveals its ontological reality, we call it beautiful. So it's a tight system if you get it right. Now notice, contemplating is in the mind. Sure, the eye gives you sense information, but the mind has to decide what to do with it. And the verb, if you look at other Thomas stuff, is viscere. So you do a little quiz. Okay, there's your cheat sheet on the right. A school with no library. Which one of these three constituent elements is primarily problematic? Integritas, yeah, don't be shy. Go ahead. It's missing something. A school with no drug dealers. That's okay, right? Because it's not an expectation ontologically that a school should have drug dealers. A curriculum that teaches first grade math to 10th graders, not because they're behind, but because someone's too lazy to buy the right book. You can see that's not proportional to the people that you're serving. School building that looks like a robotic centipede. Maybe proportionality, right? It's not revealing the nature of the dignity of learning because it's missing the things that it should have. They're all out of proportion. And then you see what happens is the revelation of the reality of the thing starts to go away. Or a catchy and well-composed school song which denigrates learning. Obviously a problem, right? You might hire the best musician out there, but at the end, it's not proportional to the function or the purpose of that school song. So it's not really that hard. You know, Jacques Maritain, who's a philosopher of beauty in the early 20th century, said, when you experience beautiful things, the mind is spared the least effort of abstraction. And abstraction in philosophical terms means looking at a lot of examples and abstracting out the essence of it. So if this was the only chair you'd ever seen, you would think all chairs look like this. Then you see two chairs and you realize chairness comes in various forms. You see 1,000 chairs. When something's beautiful, you just know what it is. And you see that robotic centipede school, you're like, well, what is that? I've never seen a school like that before. You look at another one and you say, oh, the schoolness is so evident. All I can do is rest in it. And this is why intellectual rest is associated with beauty. He says we're excused the customary task of saying, what the heck is it, right? You're a wine connoisseur. You have to go through lots of lessons to figure it out. Once you have the most beautiful Merlot or something, now that's Merlot, right? That's the ontological reality that's being given to me directly. So sometimes it requires some knowledge on our part, but we can't make something into something that it's not. Now you just ask this question, well, what is this? You know, how do you figure it out? Your mind doesn't rest in this, probably. Your mind says, oh, really? This is a church, by the way. If that's a church, then where's the cross? Why does it look like a big concrete box? Why are these windows in these crazy shapes? Why does the whole weight of the concrete look like it's supported by glass? These are all things that don't allow the mind to rest. And instead, they send the mind into labor to figure it out. You do the same thing with this new church being built in Charleston. You don't have to do a lot of work to figure this out because it's revealing its ontological reality in one of many ways, but in a way that's very clear. So if you ask the question, well, if everything that exists is beautiful, is everything the same? Is a slug equal to a person? Here's how, this is the part two of it. A thing is more beautiful in proportion to its perfection in being. So they use sometimes the example of the small glass. Maybe it's a plant. It's got participation in being, and it's full, according to its own category, but it doesn't have intellect and will and locomotion and so on. Whereas you say a human being might be a big glass, and when it's full, it's actually participating in being at a fuller level. So not everything is equal, even though that everything that exists participates in beauty in some way. This is a little chart I found in a philosophy book from a long time ago, 50s, I think. Vegetative powers, reproduction, growth, nutrition. Average sunflower can do that. Sorrow, probably not. Aversion, hate, love, anger, and then intellect and will, which are these highest capacities of the human being. And so the human beings fall at the top of the categories of existence. And then we have the capacity to be divinized. So maybe you have a chart like this in your school. I am diligent, I am helpful, I am perseverant, I am gentle. This is all an invitation to be participating at a higher level of existence. because humans have this capacity to be all these good things. And when they are formed to do it, they're actually, you could say, is more beautiful, because the humanity, the reality of the humanity, is more evident, because humans by their nature are called to greatness and kindness and gentleness and understanding and love and patience and obedience and attentiveness. And so the classical curriculum is really about making beautiful people who are more fully participating in the ontological reality, which is called humanity. And then they reveal their humanness more fully, and then they pass it on to others. So we'll wrap it up with the effects of beauty in this system. It makes the truth attractive. Anybody who wants someone to listen to something, man, make it sweet to listen to, make it attractive. And one of its effects is that it stirs desire. If you see something beautiful, you want it, and it moves the will toward the good. This is the classic definition of love, by the way, from Augustine. If the will is moved toward the good, you see your future wife across a crowded room. You don't just go, or whatever. You say, hey, do you know her? Can you introduce it? What's her name? Can I walk over there? What's my pickup line going to be, right? All of a sudden, the will is moving toward this perceived good because of that beauty. And love is that classic definition. So you want some students to love what you're teaching. If it's beautiful, they'll come to love it, and it better be true, right? Otherwise, you're a demagogue and not a teacher. And what Thomas and others will say is you move out of yourself. Ekstasis literally means ex, out of, and stasis, to stand. You stand out of yourself, and you're enraptured by something else, whether it's the Sistine Chapel ceiling, or your future spouse, or your newborn baby. You say, wow, the good is out there. I'm going to find it. I'm going to get it. I'm going to delight in it. I'm going to be formed by it. And the key word here is delight, delight, delight. Beautiful things make us delight in knowing them. Now, the president of Benedictine College asked me about an elevator pitch for the Center for Beauty and Culture, which is what I run there. He said, if I'm in the elevator with a donor, what am I going to tell him? And I'm like, well, beauty is the revelation of ontological reality. He's like, I can't do that. Come up with something I can say in 10 seconds. So I thought about it, and I came up with this. Beauty is to truth as delicious is to food. You make nourishing, flavorless gruel, you might live, but no one's going to buy it, right? You want your deliciousness to come through and also be nourishing and good. So Costco knows this, right? The lady in the hairnet's there every Saturday giving you a bit of holy guacamole, all natural guacamole. And the idea is it stirs desire in us to go get it and then know it and delight in it and learn the truth of it. Now, this is a somewhat silly example. Take it at the higher level. How do you convince someone of a classical curriculum? How do you convince someone of justice? You have to be alive and find a way to make it delightful. So here's a foyer from a school in Texas, the one I showed before, and this is the center entering thing, and you see columns of different kinds of skylight above, so there's double height room, the sunlight comes in, and then you go off to the left and the right to your classroom, and then in between each of these little architectural features are different symbols of the things that you study in a school. And so first it's, where's Waldo? What's that thing up there? And then it's, what did I learn from Waldo? Right? And the next time you come in, you know a little more about your mission as a school, as a teacher, as a student, and the architecture can reinforce that. So what do we take from all this? Beauty is not an overlay of fancy glitterness. It's not cupcakes with sprinkles. It's a flash of understanding of the good and true in a way that's so clear, so complete, and so evident that you just rest in it. Oh, sometimes I compare it to jacuzzi. Could you imagine if you had to explain a jacuzzi to someone by reading them a book about jacuzzis? It just doesn't work. But sit in a jacuzzi and it's the right temperature. Oh, now I know jacuzziness, and boy, this is delightful. And the inspiration that it brings, I want to do that. I want to know that. I want to be more like that. And then the good life comes around. What does it mean to live nobly and virtuously? And this is why we educate people. So there's a Polish poet who said, beauty enthuses us for work, and work is to raise us up. And enthusiasm is a really interesting word when you do a little etymology. It comes from the Greek to be inspired or possessed by a god, to be rapt, so enraptured, or in ecstasy. That's kind of amazing, Demagogues can do this for bad reasons, and noble people can do it for good reasons. And it actually comes from en, which is to put into, and theos, which is God. So if you're a theist, you see that word there. So when things are beautiful, they become inspirational and easier to do. That's the work. If it's beautiful, you want to do it, and the work becomes easier. And beauty is this attractive splendor that makes the hard work delightful and eager and fills us with desire. So hopefully this little quick introduction to this is helpful to you, and thanks very much for your time and attention today. Okay, perfect.